Hi everyone, I'm Eric. I have probably met some of you before at various iterations of Puppet Camp, Puppet Conf, other events over the years. I'm really happy to be here for the current evolution of the event. I've been coming to Puppet Camp since the very first one in 2009, which seems like almost an eternity ago now. It's wild to think that that was over a decade. I've been using Puppet for a long time, and before Puppet, I was using CF Engine and doing other kinds of large scale configuration management. I've been at Puppet since 2012, where mostly I worked on the core Puppet and Puppet Enterprise. But about a year ago, I moved over to work on our cloud technologies. And outside of work, I play music, as you can see behind me, and enjoy playing pinball. I've been renting a pinball game since we've been in lockdown to help keep me and my cohabitants sane for the duration. Before we dive into the technical portion of the talk, I want to acknowledge the importance of the moment that we're living through here. The COVID pandemic, I think, exposed a lot of holes in our social safety net that a lot of people are falling through. And more recently, the public murders of and the police violence against Black and brown people across the country has really laid bare the systemic racism that permeates the United States. On a personal note, I want to acknowledge both the emotional burden that we're all dealing with and its effects on our mental health, on our productivity, and on our daily lives. And I also want to acknowledge my own privilege in being a beneficiary of these systems that hurt other people and give me the opportunity to continue to work and make a living, and in fact, to talk to you here today. We are in uncharted territory here. We're off the map. It's scary, but it does present the opportunity to build our own course, and if we're willing to dig in and do the work, affect some real change in the world around us. And despite all of this that's going on, we have jobs to do if we still have a job, and it's a balancing act to be able to, again, acknowledge that difficulty and that reality, and yet still keep our heads down and do what we need to do. And yeah, just wanted to acknowledge that it's tough out there. Let's get into it here. Let's say over the past 5 years or so, we've been seeing a shift in the center of gravity for where and how automation happens. The driver for this is often expressed in the phrase, we're moving to the cloud, but the cloud is more of a catalyst for change than the mechanism for it. By which I mean the adoption of cloud-centric practices like provisioning through APIs instead of bare metal, or moving to containerization to reduce stack dependencies and speed up your development. They're not intrinsically tied to running your services on AWS or Google or Azure. They might not even leave a VMware stack that's inside your data center. But regardless of how cloud native hipstery you choose to get, these practices do change the way that automation happens, and they require some changes in our tools and approaches as well. Some of the most important changes that we're seeing are a shift from model-driven or hybrid model and task-driven automation to event-driven automation. I'll talk more about that in a moment. A shift from the machine, the node as the center of automation, into APIs and configuring things sort of at arm's length through remote requests. Everything from provisioning CPU and storage to DNS and load balancing. And importantly for Puppet, there's a shift in how configuration management fits into the rest of the automation landscape and the rest of the tool chain. Rather than being the central driver of your automation platform, config management is more a piece in a larger picture that's centered more squarely on the application delivery and what we can do in service of getting applications out to customers faster. So as we've been talking with customers and the community and the industry over the past few years, we've been trying to understand how we can help in this changing world. I like this image. It comes from a little bookshop here in Portland called Microcosm Publishing. And I like it because the final stage of evolution is on being on a bicycle. Like Steve Jobs once said that computers are like a bicycle for your mind. And as somebody who is both an avid cyclist and rides a lot, as well as somebody who spent several months laid up due to an injury from a cycling crash, I appreciate both sides of that equation. It is a double-edged sword. There's always been automation. It may not always have been great, but the lowest common denominator was and still is the shell script. It gets the job done. It's better than doing things by hand. But when CF Engine and Puppet came along, it really brought along this idea of model-driven automation, where the actor was this system under management that acted more or less autonomously to configure itself, to bring itself in line with defined desired state. And I probably don't have to explain too much of this to the audience. Over time, though, we saw that people wanted to move more towards task-driven automation, making changes on demand, particularly when we needed to express things that spanned across multiple nodes. When we wanted to do things from rolling out a change in Puppet code, for example, that needed to be phased out to different systems in order to make sure it worked, up to application deployment, or deploying infrastructure that needed to be created before you could begin to manage it. Those kinds of things required some task-based orchestration, and an evolution of that we've been working on recently is around this model and task hybrid. So we like the idea of having top-down directed automation that handles things in a particular defined order, but the individual resources on the systems can still be managed through desired state management using Puppet or other tools to enforce the model on each individual system that's under management, even though the linkage between them is a more imperative orchestrated description. And more recently, we're seeing a shift towards event-driven workflows where something that happens upstream on an automated system needs to drive change downstream and cause other automation to kick off across your infrastructure. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. Sorry, I have a double setup here, so I'm trying to keep things in sync. So with all that in mind, we've introduced some product updates lately that I'm really excited to talk about. There's, first off, a new long-term support release just came out 2 days ago. It's 2019.8. A lot of our customers really like the long-term support releases that have support for 2 years. This one goes out into 2022, which if we're all still here on this earth, that would be a great thing to have to worry about, is upgrading your Puppet Enterprise installation. But people really do appreciate these long support cycles. The previous LTS is getting pretty long in the tooth, and so it's nice to be able to roll in some really great functionality and feature improvements inside of this PE release, in addition to being able to provide a clean upgrade path and support well into the future. One of the headline features of it is the ability to bring systems under management for managing their patches, their operating system patches, and this is independent from any Puppet configuration that they might have. My tiny little test cluster here has one out of 4 systems under patch management, but all of them have agents installed. So this allows you to connect up to the operating system's upstream package provider and keep systems up to date. Excuse me. Another great feature is the ability to run bulk plans through the orchestrator. This is, I think, kind of the fullest expression of that hybrid model and task-driven automation that I was talking about a moment ago. Bulk plans allow you to intersperse ordered sequence of actions across nodes with individual Puppet code blocks that allow you to manage resources on each one of those systems with existing Puppet modules. And now you have the ability to manage those plans and to execute them through the PE console, which includes fine-grained role-based access control and audit logging for those things. If you have a lot of environments, you'll really appreciate this next feature. It's lockless code deployment, meaning that if you have multiple environments, previously we had to pause catalog compilation while new code was rolled out into the Puppet masters, and now you can have a versioned code directory that gets deployed asynchronously, and then the compilation flips over to it when the deployment's complete, meaning that you never have to pause your catalog compilation in order to get new versions of code out across your infrastructure. For folks that have environments that range up into the 20s to 50s to hundreds. This is a much requested feature, and I think it should greatly speed up the ability to deploy code quickly. Plus, there's an entire slew of look and feel improvements throughout the entire console. The team has really done a great job of updating and normalizing both the user experience as well as the interaction for different parts of the console and making it much more workflow oriented rather than it being about the kinds of data that is being presented. In addition to Puppet Enterprise, we had a new continuous delivery for PE, or CD for PE, release yesterday afternoon that has some really neat improvements. CD for PE started out as a way to manage Puppet code deployments, but it's added features that make it more like a dashboard for the rest of us, for the teams that use Puppet but aren't in the guts of their Puppet infrastructure all day long. Kat Rayburn's going to talk about this a little bit later today, so stick around for that. But the headline of the release yesterday is that we now have inventory reporting across the state, as well as the ability to designate individual module owners for parts of your infrastructure that they can manage their own module rollouts and deployments. So again, if you have teams or people that are involved with Puppet, that maybe have a module that they're responsible for that's widely used, but they're not responsible for running the servers or really managing the automation infrastructure overall, PD4P is a great way to give them a workflow that allows them to manage the parts that they're responsible for, to roll out changes they need to without necessarily giving away the keys to the kingdom. Also, Puppet Remediate has been iterating like crazy. The idea with Remediate was that operations folks who work with security teams need a better way to navigate their vulnerability reporting and remediation than the status quo, which shockingly, even in the year 2020, it often involves printing out hundreds of pages of PDFs and carrying them from one part of the office to the other. Probably now the printing has evolved, but they're still shipping around tons of overly verbose reports that are really hard to take action on. And if you're responsible for fixing the vulnerabilities, it was hard to pick through all that information and find what the most important thing was that you had to fix today. And so that's where Puppet Remediate comes in. It prioritizes the most important things to fix and uses tasks under the hood to go out and fix them. The most recent releases add an improvement to the prioritization algorithms, as well as the ability to define maintenance windows during which remediation should and should not happen, and that should hopefully help keep your security teams happy. Both of these have much more detailed posts about the feature updates on the puppet.com/blog on the blog recently, so go and check it out if you're interested in more information about that. One additional update that people might not be aware of is that we started offering support for open source Puppet users, and you can log into this URL here and create yourself an account for free. There's a bunch of the knowledge-based style content from our support team that's available for free, and we've added this Puppet Assist product offering that allows you to add a subscription and get access to additional content that's on here, as well as up to 3 sessions with a Puppet support engineer for guidance and troubleshooting. If you have a particularly thorny problem with a module that you're writing, or performance problem, or something else that's going on in the infrastructure, this can be a great way to jumpstart your troubleshooting and get past whatever's blocking you so that you can get back to your job. And of course, the thing that I'm been working on, we launched yesterday as well. It's been a busy week at Puppet. It's called Relay, and this is a service that I want to spend the rest of the time I have just to talk through very quickly and introduce it to you and talk about why we're building it and how it works. So I mentioned earlier that we've been thinking about the problem of event-driven automation, and I wanted to break down exactly what that means. There's sort of 3 parts to it. Events, which are things that happen across the infrastructure, are represented usually as messages that are passed around between the services, like an alert for monitoring. more and more of our tools are both generating and consuming these events, and they sort of taking the humans out of the equation and allowing the systems to talk to one another to let them know what they want. The middle part, driven, meaning the events come in and they cause other things to happen. So once you have a receiver, a sender and a receiver for these events, connecting them together means that when an event comes in, something ought to happen. And that's the last part. What ought to happen? Well, some kind of automation. The part that we're really interested in is bits that people have stuck together with what Deepak calls digital duct tape. You might have a really great provisioning process and a really great ticket management process, but at some point someone has to log in and update the ticket, close it, send the emails. Those kinds of things are not great. A lot of times people will automate these things. As I said, they frequently fall back to that shell script as a way to get it done, but those end up being not super repeatable. They're risky. They can provide security problems, and they sort of end up consolidating that knowledge back down into a silo. So Relay is a system that is intended to fix these problems. It listens to, as it says, signals from your existing tools and triggers workflows. Our tool chain is really complicated these days, and a lot of the automation could, again, be sort of stuck together rather than be very systematic. So we think there's some ability there's some value in having the ability to link the incoming actions with some intelligent system in the middle and responding automatically. The response could be in the form of a workflow that maybe is like that digital duct tape, but with bells on. Maybe it's like bulletproof duct tape. I'm not sure. I got to think through that metaphor a little better. But things like having programmatic secure access to API keys, an audit log of when it ran, nice Puppet style properties like infrastructure as code, and being able to check things in to Git and use GitOps workflows in order to deploy changes to those to the automation. That's definitely a step above running a shell script out of your home directory. How does it actually work? Well, it's built around the idea of workflows, and I'll go through this very quickly because my time is running short and I don't want to throw us off for the day, but there's tons more of this information on our website on relay.sh. And the idea is that we have both triggers which respond to events, steps that are containers which run and respond in the defined sequence that's in the code, and we have the ability to have approvals that break out of a workflow and let you wait for a manual process or a callback from another system before they move on. Again, each of these things runs as a container. It runs on GKE on a Google Kubernetes engine, and the container runs until completion, then maybe modifies the output, modifies the metadata that workflow has access to, and hands it off to the next system. Under the hood, we have the idea, as I mentioned, of workflows as code and infrastructure as code. This isn't quite code, it's YAML. It's sort of the lowest common denominator of infrastructure code, but it's familiar, it's easy to get started with, and the language is ultimately, I think, not the super important part here. It's what you can do with it and how you connect things together. There's a powerful secret engine that allows you to keep keys and secrets securely on the service using HashiCorp Vault, and then you can reference them in the workflows. You can share them across a team, but only have to input them once. There's a trust relationship between the front end and the Vault server, so that the front end can only write or delete the secrets. You can never read them out again. And as I mentioned, you can use these output tags, like in the bottom line there in line 38, to pass data from one step to another, maybe doing transformations as it moves through the system. So again, this is sort of a whirlwind workflow. I'm happy to talk about this more. The last key component of this is really around the integrations and what you can do with it. We have a pretty substantial library of useful integrations that we think are going to cover the most common use cases. And the integrations themselves are easy to extend, easy to use. If you already have existing containers that you want to use in Relay, you can just point the service at your container registry and have it download them. They do have to be publicly accessible. I'll caveat that, although we're looking very heavily at what it would take to add connectors to get back onto on-premise infrastructure. And the step authoring for it is a pretty simple process, and we tried to make the authoring experience fun and easy to use and well documented. So if there's not something that's already out there that does the exact step that you need done, it should be easy to add it. The entire integrations library is open source. We made a GitHub organization for it, as you can see here under GitHub/relay-integrations. And we welcome pull requests and suggestions and issues if you get started with this and run into trouble. Again, super quick run through. I'm happy to talk about this in more detail on Slack. Let me wrap up by saying we're all at different points on that continuum of the waves that I was talking about at the beginning. Parts of the same organization may even be different on different points of the continuum. So where some people are surfing the waves and other people are barely keeping their head above water. But roughly speaking, we're still at the beginning of this big sea change away from the on-prem, everything's inside your perimeter, systems are the center of the world kind of mindset. And we're moving towards one that's cloud first, if not yet completely cloud native. We can see what's coming, and while there's a lot of unpredictability, there's one thing certain, that there's no going back to the world that's moving more slowly, that has a high degree of predictability, a high degree of control. That ship has sailed. And I will stop here with the nautical metaphor, but I will say that our job is really to adapt to these conditions and maybe see a little bit ahead and be ready to handle whatever problems the world throws our way. That's all I've got for this morning. Thank you for your time and attention. I'm going to hand it back to Demetrius, and just as a quick preview of what's coming up next, I think Jeffrey Miller is up immediately next, and as I mentioned, we have a Kat will be talking later. Richard Romanis is talking about ServiceNow, and Ben Ford will be chatting about telemetry later. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.